What's up everyone, Pedro here with Syzygy Coffee. On today's video, I want to talk about how coffee is harvested at different altitudes and how that actually directly affects your cup, not only on the flavor, but on the costs. Stick around. Now, the easiest way to sort of understand and explain this is if we divide the coffee harvesting into three different tiers: low altitude, medium altitude, and high altitude. Now there's different altitudes in between, of course. You can go to very low or mid-high or very high, but generally speaking, it's easier to understand if we just divide it into those three different tiers. So let's start at the very bottom. Let's start with low altitude coffee. Anything that's harvested in 0 to 1,000 meters above sea level. A good point of reference is Brazilian coffee, which is fantastic coffee, and it is a low altitude coffee. Now, what's good about this coffee is that it is a very traditional tasting coffee. It's fantastic. Some farms produce fantastic specialty quality coffee beans, and the work that goes behind it is amazing. And you're always going to get something that is very familiar and very nice to drink. If we go to a medium altitude coffee, that is something between 1,000 meters to around 2,000 meters. You can think of countries such as El Salvador or more famously Colombian coffee. Now, this is where when compared to Brazilian coffee or when compared to a lower altitude coffee, you start adding a little bit more complexity into the bean. You start getting a little bit more acidity, a little bit more floral notes or fruity notes into that coffee bean. Finally, with high altitude coffee, what you're looking at is anything from 2,000 meters and up, usually around 3,000 meters, but there are very high altitude coffees as well, right? But the idea with higher altitude coffee is that you are paying more for that coffee for a number of reasons. You're going to start getting coffee that is more complex, sometimes very complex, very acidic, very floral. A lot of tasting notes that go around with high altitude coffee. And why does it happen? So I'll ask you this question. What's easier, to pick something here on the ground or to climb a mountain and pick it up there? So the answer is pretty simple, and the same is true for coffee. With coffee that is harvested at ground level, what you're getting is access to water, easier access to picking the different coffee cherries, much easier to work and treat. However, you do get more diseases that affect that coffee bean. The coffee cherries tend to be a little bit more plump or bigger because they have so much access to water that they actually retain a lot of liquid, and the flavor is not as intense once you start harvesting that little coffee cherry. Once you start going up to that 2,000, 3,000 meter mark, the oxygen, for one, is a little bit thinner. So the coffee plant needs to work harder to produce the coffee cherry. Another thing, of course, is you don't have so much water. So the coffee plant itself, when you compare a high altitude coffee plant to a lower altitude coffee plant, the coffee plant that is at high altitude is not going to produce as many cherries, and they're generally going to be very small. And this is actually great for us as a consumer or a drinker, because what you're getting is less water retention on that coffee cherry, and you're getting a lot more flavor and sugars and complexity in that cherry. Now, I'll refer you to this chart right here. Use it as a rule of thumb. It's a great way to sort of understand how coffee is affected by the different altitudes. Now, I added the process here as well, natural, or if it's wash or wet process, as a point of reference as well. I'm going to make a video on that later on. But if you start at the top, you'll see Brazilian coffee, as I mentioned earlier, at a low altitude around 0 to 100 meters. If it's a natural process, you're getting nutty, sweet, with a low acidity in full-bodied coffee, or a clean, sweet, and light-body, mild coffee. If you go all the way to the Ethiopian coffee, which, by the way, I forgot to mention where to get good quality, high altitude coffee. Ethiopia is the way to go. If you look at Ethiopian coffee, you're starting to get a brighter, higher acidity coffee, generally more complex. And the only way for us to sort of enhance these flavors, be it a lower altitude or a medium altitude or a higher altitude, is through us, the roasters. That is sort of our promise and what we want to make sure that you as the coffee drinker enjoy the most. And this is why what we do as roasters is very important. We want to make sure that the hard work that goes behind harvesting these coffees, specifically those coffees that are harvested at such high altitudes, get enjoyed correctly. The coffee roasting process is very, it's complex, but it's a lot of fun. And once you start putting the pieces together, you understand why specialty coffee needs to meet certain criteria and certain standards. So in other words, if you want to enjoy a good cup of coffee and make sure that the flavors that are being offered to you by that coffee farm or the harvester of that coffee, you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of that coffee cherry. That is where we come in, and that is sort of our promise, right? We want to make sure that you guys are enjoying the best cup of coffee, and the only way to do that is through a correct roasting process. Now, if you know anything about the different roasting profiles, you'll understand that the lighter the roast, the more you're retaining that original flavor profile. Once you start going up into medium roast or a darker roast, you start sort of losing that initial flavor. And those sort of flavors between a high altitude coffee and a low altitude coffee, the higher the roast, they start kind of blending together. So you start actually losing a lot of the sort of the idea of buying a higher altitude coffee that has more complex flavors. So my suggestion would be, if you are into complexity, very interesting flavors, something new, something that perhaps you've never tried before, my suggestion would be go for a high altitude coffee that is roasted lightly or medium light roast, and you'll be surprised at what you'll find. You'll start tasting things that you perhaps never thought would have been possible to taste in a cup of coffee. And I really do hope that you guys get to experience it. And that's pretty much it, guys. Now, keep in mind that there's a lot of things that go into harvesting and processing coffee. Altitude is one of them, but the roasting process is another thing. The soil that the coffee used to be harvested in is another thing. The type of water and quantity of water. So there's a lot of things that make that coffee bean spectacular. And the only way to sort of experience it is to try it out. My suggestion would be buy 2 different coffee bags. Try to buy something low altitude coffee and something that is high altitude or very high altitude coffee, and just try them out. Ideally, same roast profile, light or medium light roast, and the same process, natural or washed. And grab those 2 bags and give them a shot. Try them out and you'll see the difference. On our end, in Syzygy's website, you'll see different coffees varying from El Salvador, which is in Colombia, which are both medium. We have Brazilian coffee, which is low, and we also have Ethiopian coffee, which is high. In our website, you'll find the details on the altitude. We have that as well posted in the description. And let me know your thoughts. What do you like? Do you like low altitude coffee? Do you like high altitude coffee? Are you interested in more fruity tasting coffee, acidity, or do you want something a little bit more traditional, more chocolatey, more nutty, more full-bodied? Let me know in the comments. And that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.